British elections used to be two-way fights, but in Thursday night's televised debate, no fewer than 7 party leaders are competing for votes that could give each of them a role in the next government, and perhaps even a say in a new constitutional settlement for this ancient kingdom. Martin Wolf is the FT's chief economics commentator. Martin, it's quite an incredible thing. Brits used to be content either to vote Labour or to vote Conservative in almost all constituencies. Why has the range of political choice suddenly exploded?
Well, it is part of a long-term slide. I mean, 50 years ago, the two main parties got well over 90% of the vote, nearly 100 at one point, and now it's down to close to 2/3. It's been a steady slide, and that's already made it more unstable. That's why we have a coalition government now. After the last election was not different, very similar shares. But what's changed since then, clearly, is the Lib Dems, Liberal Democrats, are no longer the favourite protest vote party. So we've got a new one, UKIP, which focuses on immigration and Europe. And then we've got this seismic revolution. I think it's the key thing in Scotland. The referendum triggered a mass swing of voters from Labour to the Scottish National Party, and they seem likely to get most of the seats in Scotland because of their regional concentration of votes. Those are the two really big changes we see.
Right. Now, the big question that everybody has their eyes on immediately is what happens to the government's economic policy after the election. The big difference between the Conservatives and Labour is on their fiscal stance. What's your bet on how that policy might change?
Well, obviously, first of all, we don't know who's going to be in power. At the moment, what we're seeing in the polls is that neither side will be in power. They won't have enough and to be in power on their own, and actually even forming a coalition will be very difficult. So the first thing we know, if that's correct, is that neither side is going to get what they want. They're going to have to do deals with others. So then it really becomes very uncertain. But what we can say is that the Conservatives have put out a plan which is the most austere you can possibly imagine, which is a very substantial further cuts in spending relative to GDP, and overall fiscal surplus. And the Labour position is probably about the loosest you can imagine, which is perhaps 2-3 percentage points of GDP more spending and a bit more taxes. Okay. Those are the extremes. And my own view is, given that we've already had a massive amount of austerity, the overall fiscal deficit is down to 4% of GDP next year, it's not going to make much difference, barring some huge crisis. So it's not something people should get too worked up about.
Now, there is arguably a bigger question, which is not about the policy of the next government so much as the constitutional settlement that the next government might create, which could outlast it by decades. Do you think that the current system hands quite an advantage to the biggest parties? Is that still going to be tenable?
Well, we actually had a vote in the last Parliament on electoral reform, and the Conservatives scuppered it completely, and it was a referendum, and the Lib Dems went away hurt. So there's no necessity, however unfair, and this is going to be very unfair, the outcome will be. I mean, one aspect of the unfairness is it looks at the moment that UKIP might get 4 times as many votes as the SNP. But UKIP might end up with 1 or 2 seats, and the SNP will end up with 40. Now, that really is anomalous. But moving to a true proportional election system, nobody really wants to do that, except for the small parties, and nobody's going to give it to them. So I think the really big constitutional change would be with Scotland, and particularly if we got a Labour government supported by the SNP, making demands for more money, more decentralisation, more autonomy for Scotland, at the same time as supporting the Labour Party in governing England. And I think that would create a lot of tensions in England. The Conservatives will start running on the English Votes for English Laws platform to try and destroy the Labour Party in England, saying essentially they're ruling with foreigners. And I think that could destabilise the constitution between England and Scotland still further, and raise yet again the question of Scottish independence.
It's shaping up to be an extraordinary election. It might well be an extraordinary government. Martin Wolf, many thanks.
Pleasure.